Any meaningful rereading of Scripture in the modern context does not begin by adding new meanings, but by dismantling interpretive habits that have become so familiar they are no longer questioned. One such habit concerns the way animals are understood within the biblical text. Traditionally, animals have been reduced to simple moral symbols. The lion signifies strength, the lamb gentleness, the serpent cunning. At another level, they are often treated as remnants of a primitive mythological imagination, figures that belong more to symbolic storytelling than to serious theological reflection. Both approaches, however, share a fundamental limitation. They sever theology from ecology and reinforce an anthropocentric framework in which all meaning ultimately revolves around human experience and moral instruction. The implications of this interpretive reduction are not merely academic, they are existential. When animals are stripped of their ontological weight and reduced to symbolic tools for human teaching, they cease to function as participants within the created order. Nature, in turn, becomes little more than a backdrop for the drama of human salvation. This conceptual separation legitimizes a posture of exploitation. If the non-human world exists only to illustrate human truths, then it can be used, managed, and consumed without theological consequence. In this way, a seemingly harmless interpretive tradition contributes, subtly but decisively, to a worldview in which the human being stands above and outside the very web of life upon which it depends. It is precisely at this juncture that a new thesis must be articulated. Animals in Scripture should be understood not as mere symbols, but as elements within an eco-theological code, a sophisticated semiotic system through which the biblical text communicates the interdependence of all creation. Within this framework, each creature is not simply an allegory of a moral trait, but an index of a specific ecological function. The lion is not only strength, but the apex predator within a trophic hierarchy. The ox is not only service, but a representation of agrarian ecosystems and domesticated interspecies cooperation. The birds of the air are not merely emblems of freedom, but indicators of atmospheric systems and migratory patterns that sustain planetary balance. When these figures are read relationally rather than individually, they begin to disclose a deeper logic. Life does not exist in isolation, but in a network of mutual dependence, where each node is structurally and functionally indispensable. This shift in interpretation also reconfigures the relationship between creation and the Creator. Instead of a linear model, God creates, humanity rules, a multidimensional structure emerges, in which all creation participates in a dynamic orientation toward the divine. Nature is no longer a passive object under human dominion, but an active medium of revelation, a living language through which divine presence is mediated and perceived. In this sense, the natural world becomes sacramental, not merely existing, but signifying, communicating, and participating in a reality that exceeds itself. To sustain such a reading, a rigorous interdisciplinary methodology is required. Biblical theology provides the textual and doctrinal foundation. Ancient Near Eastern iconography offers critical insight into the symbolic grammar within which these texts were originally composed, and modern ecology supplies the scientific framework necessary to understand the interrelations between living systems. When these disciplines are brought into dialogue, a post-anthropocentric reading becomes possible, one that does not eliminate the human, but resituates it within the broader community of life. This resituation becomes even more evident when considered against the backdrop of ancient Near Eastern culture. Contrary to the assumption that ancient symbolic systems universally privileged the human as the central figure, a closer examination reveals a far more complex ontology. Hybrid beings, composite figures combining human, animal, and avian features, appear frequently in art, architecture, and religious imagination. These are not arbitrary mythological constructions. They are visual theologies that articulate a world in which boundaries between forms of life are porous and dynamic. Power, in such a system, is not concentrated exclusively in the human, but distributed across multiple modes of being. Within this symbolic universe, the human does not stand above nature, but within an interconnected matrix of living forces. The hybridity of these figures reflects a fundamental intuition. Life is a continuum rather than a rigid hierarchy. This stands in stark contrast to the dominant trajectory of modern thought, in which the human increasingly isolates itself from the natural world. Through technological advancement, nature is not only observed, but controlled, quantified, and ultimately commodified. It becomes an object of manipulation rather than a community of which humanity is a part. The consequences of this epistemological shift are now unmistakable. Climate crisis, biodiversity collapse, and mass extinction are not isolated phenomena. They are systemic outcomes of a worldview that has mislocated the human within the order of creation. By positioning itself outside the web of life, humanity has also placed itself beyond the natural constraints that sustain ecological balance. What appears as dominance is, in reality, a form of dislocation, an estrangement from the very conditions that make life possible. Therefore, what is required is not merely behavioral adjustment, but a fundamental reorientation of human self-understanding. The human being must be reconceived not as the master of the earth, but as a participant within a vast ecological community. Likewise, the concept of stewardship must be redefined. It cannot mean control or exploitation under a theological mandate. Rather, it must signify responsibility, care, and the maintenance of relational equilibrium. Authority in this reconfigured framework is not the right to dominate, but the capacity to sustain and protect. It is within this movement, from domination to participation, from separation to interdependence, that a new theological horizon begins to emerge. This is a theology that does not limit salvation to the human sphere, but extends it to the restoration of the entire created order. In such a vision, the language of the wild is no longer peripheral or ornamental. It becomes essential, an integral dimension of divine revelation, inviting humanity not to stand above creation, but to listen, to participate, and ultimately, to belong. Building upon this reorientation, from anthropocentric reduction toward an integrated eco-theological vision, the figure of the tetramorph emerges not as a decorative anomaly within Scripture, but as a structural key to its deeper cosmology. Traditionally encountered in prophetic and apocalyptic literature, the four living creatures have often been interpreted symbolically or allegorically, their composite forms reduced to theological abstractions or Christological typologies. Yet within the framework established above, such a reading proves insufficient. The tetramorph must instead be understood as a set of liturgical agents, non-human priests whose function is not merely to signify, but to actively participate in the ongoing worship that binds creation to its creator. To define the tetramorph theologically in this way requires a shift from semiotics to ontology. These beings are not simply signs pointing beyond themselves, they are subjects embedded within a relational field of praise. Their existence is inherently doxological. They do not represent worship, they enact it. This distinction is critical. If animals within Scripture are part of an eco-theological code, then the tetramorph constitutes a moment where that code becomes explicit, embodied, and performative. The lion, the ox, the human, and the eagle are not arranged arbitrarily. They form a liturgical quadrivium, a fourfold articulation of life's response to divine presence. Each face speaks from within its ecological domain, yet all converge in a unified act of glorification. Their role, therefore, is fundamentally mediatory. Positioned between a groaning earth and a transcendent yet immanent creator, the tetramorph functions as a conduit through which the voice of creation is gathered, intensified, and returned as praise. The phrase, "the whole creation groans," acquires here a liturgical dimension. The suffering, fragmentation, and instability of ecological systems are not silent phenomena, but latent expressions awaiting articulation. The four living creatures give form to this articulation. They do not speak instead of creation in a substitutive sense. Rather, they speak from within it as its concentrated voice. In this way, they mediate not only upward, toward God, but also downward, refracting divine presence back into the created order. Such a configuration has profound theological implications. Most notably, it destabilizes the long-standing assumption that priesthood is an exclusively human vocation. If the tetramorph performs a priestly function, gathering, representing, and offering creation in worship, then priesthood must be redefined as a distributed capacity within creation itself. Humanity does not lose its role, but it is no longer singular. Instead, it becomes one voice among many within a cosmic liturgy. The category of priest expands beyond anthropological boundaries and becomes ecological in scope. This expansion leads to a further conclusion. Creation itself is liturgical. Worship is not confined to temples, rituals, or human speech acts. It is an ontological orientation embedded within the fabric of existence. Every ecological interaction, predation, growth, decay, migration, participates, however indirectly, in a broader movement of return and response. The cosmos is not merely created, it is celebratory. The tetramorph, in this sense, does not introduce worship into creation, but reveals it as always already present. This liturgical cosmology finds one of its most striking expressions in the vision of the prophet Ezekiel. Emerging from the trauma of Babylonian exile, Ezekiel's vision must be situated within a context of profound dislocation. The loss of land was not merely political, it was ecological and theological. Israel's identity was deeply tied to a specific geography, a land understood as both gift and covenantal space. Exile, therefore, entailed not only displacement, but a rupture in the perceived stability of divine presence. If God was associated with the temple in Jerusalem, what did it mean to encounter God in a foreign imperial landscape? It is precisely within this crisis that Ezekiel's vision unfolds, and its most radical feature is the mobility of the divine throne. The chariot, complex, multidirectional, and animated by living creatures, subverts any notion of a static, localized deity. God is not confined to a sacred architecture. Divine presence is dynamic, capable of movement, accompaniment, and co-suffering. The throne does not remain in Jerusalem, it appears in exile. This mobility reconfigures sacred space. Holiness is no longer anchored to a single site, but becomes coextensive with the movement of life itself. Within this vision, the four faces of the living creatures take on renewed significance. They are not decorative elements of a visionary spectacle, they are symbolic condensations of ecological totality. The lion represents the wild, untamed ecosystems governed by predation, competition, and resilience. The ox signifies domesticated life, agriculture, labor, and the intricate interdependence between human and animal systems. The human face introduces consciousness, ethical deliberation, and relational awareness. The eagle extends the field upward, encompassing the atmospheric domain, migration, wind currents, and the invisible dynamics that sustain climatic balance. Taken together, these four forms do not merely coexist, they interpenetrate. They form a single organismic structure, one body with four faces, moving in perfect coordination. This unity is not uniformity. Each face retains its distinctiveness, yet none operates independently. The vision thus articulates a principle of ecological integration, diversity without fragmentation, unity without reduction. No domain of life is self-sufficient. Each depends on the others for its stability and continuation. The movement of the chariot further intensifies this insight. It does not proceed in a linear or hierarchical fashion. It moves in any direction without turning, suggesting a multi-directional responsiveness. This can be read as a theological analog to ecological systems, which do not operate through rigid top-down control, but through complex, adaptive interactions. Divine presence, as depicted here, is not imposed upon creation from above. It circulates within it, animating and being reflected through its interconnected processes. In this light, the vision of Ezekiel becomes more than a prophetic spectacle. It becomes a theological ecology. It affirms that no ecosystem exists in isolation, that every form of life is implicated in a larger whole, and that divine presence is not external to this system, but dynamically engaged within it. The exile, rather than negating God's presence, reveals its mobility and resilience. God is not absent from ecological collapse or displacement. God moves within it, accompanying creation in its fragmentation and sustaining its possibility of renewal. Thus, the tetramorph and the chariot vision together deepen the trajectory established earlier. They move the discussion from interpretive theory to visionary ontology, from how we read the text to how the text redefines reality itself. In their convergence, a coherent picture emerges, creation as a liturgical, interconnected, and divinely animated whole, in which the boundaries between symbol and subject, nature and worship, are no longer rigidly maintained, but dynamically and meaningfully dissolved. Extending the trajectory established in the preceding sections, where creation is disclosed as a liturgical, interconnected, and dynamically God-oriented reality, the throne room vision in the Book of Revelation intensifies and universalizes this ecological theology. What appears at first glance as an otherworldly, apocalyptic tableau is, upon closer examination, a radical reconfiguration of worship itself. The most striking feature is not merely the presence of heavenly beings, but the order in which worship unfolds. Contrary to deeply ingrained assumptions shaped by anthropocentric liturgical traditions, the first voice in the act of worship does not belong to human saints, elders, or redeemed souls. It belongs to the living creatures. This inversion is not incidental. It is programmatic. The living creatures, continuous with the tetramorphic figures encountered in Ezekiel, initiate the doxological movement. Their ceaseless proclamation establishes the rhythm and structure of the entire liturgical environment. Human participation, though real and significant, is secondary and responsive rather than primary. The implication is profound. Worship is not an exclusively human activity into which other forms of life are symbolically incorporated. Rather, it is an ontological activity of creation itself, into which humanity is invited to enter. The priority of the living creatures signals that the capacity to glorify the Creator is distributed across the spectrum of life, not centralized in the human. Within this framework, the tetramorph must again be reconsidered, not as a static apocalyptic symbol, but as an ecological imperative encoded within visionary language. The four living forms, representing distinct yet interdependent domains of life, do not merely describe the structure of creation. They prescribe a mode of existence. Their perpetual harmony, coordination, and orientation toward the divine constitute a model of ecological stability. In a world increasingly defined by imbalance, climatic disruption, habitat collapse, and systemic fragmentation, the tetramorph functions as a theological counter-image, a vision of what it means for diverse forms of life to remain integrated without erasing difference. Thus, the apocalyptic imagery becomes ethically charged. It calls not for escapism from the material world, but for a re-engagement with it under a transformed understanding. The stability embodied by the living creatures is not achieved through domination or uniformity, but through relational coherence. Each domain, wild, domesticated, human, atmospheric, retains its integrity while participating in a larger order. The vision, therefore, operates as a form of ecological instruction, a symbolic mandate to restore balance where it has been lost, and to recognize that the health of one domain is inseparable from the health of the others. This reconfiguration of worship also entails a redefinition of sacred space. The spatial symbolism of the throne room is structured around the four directions, an arrangement that extends beyond architectural design into cosmological significance. The fourfold orientation suggests totality, north, south, east, and west, encompassing the entirety of the inhabited world. In this sense, the throne room is not a localized sanctuary, but a symbolic condensation of the whole earth. The presence of God at the center does not sacralize a single site, it sacralizes the totality of creation. The conclusion follows with conceptual clarity. The true temple is not a constructed edifice, but the biosphere itself. This does not negate the historical role of temples, but relativizes them. They become anticipatory or representational spaces, pointing toward a more expansive reality in which all of creation functions as a dwelling place of divine presence. The distinction between sacred and profane space begins to dissolve, replaced by a gradient of awareness. Where divine presence is recognized, space becomes sacred, not by transformation of substance, but by transformation of perception. From this apocalyptic horizon, the argument moves naturally into a Christological deepening. The early Church, in its interpretive tradition, made a decisive connection between the tetramorph and the four Gospels. The lion, the ox, the human, and the eagle were not only cosmic symbols, they were also associated with the four evangelists and their respective portraits of Christ. This association has often been treated as a matter of symbolic correspondence, but within an eco-theological framework, it takes on a more ontological significance. Each gospel, in this reading, does not merely present a different theological emphasis. It articulates a dimension of Christ's relation to the whole of creation. The lion, associated with one gospel, evokes the domain of wild nature, power, sovereignty, and the untamed dynamics of life beyond human control. The ox, linked to another, draws attention to domesticated life, labor, sacrifice, and the intimate entanglement of human and animal economies. The human face emphasizes relationality, moral consciousness, and the social dimension of existence. The eagle, finally, extends the vision upward, evoking transcendence, perception, and the atmospheric realm that envelops and sustains all terrestrial life. To say that Christ is reflected in these four forms is to suggest that the Incarnation cannot be confined to a purely anthropological category. Christ does not assume human nature in isolation from the rest of creation. Rather, the human becomes the point of intersection through which the entire material order is gathered and reconciled. The traditional formulation, that Christ is fully human and fully divine, remains intact, but its implications expand. The humanity assumed by Christ is not abstract. It is embedded within ecological and material networks. To assume humanity is, implicitly, to assume the conditions that make humanity possible: air, water, soil, microbial life, and the broader systems that sustain biological existence. This leads to a re-articulation of redemption. Salvation can no longer be understood as an exclusively human transaction, a moral or spiritual correction detached from the material world. Instead, it must be conceived as a process that encompasses the restoration of matter itself. The Incarnation initiates not only the reconciliation of human beings with God, but the reordering of the entire created order. Ecological systems, biological processes, and even molecular structures fall within the horizon of this restorative movement. Such a claim may appear expansive, but it is consistent with the logic already established. If creation participates in a cosmic liturgy, if the tetramorph mediates the voice of the biosphere, and if divine presence is dynamically engaged within ecological processes, then the work of Christ cannot be restricted to a single layer of reality. It must be coextensive with the scope of creation itself. Redemption, in this sense, is not an escape from the material, but its transfiguration. The convergence of apocalyptic vision and Christological reflection thus produces a unified theological ecology. The throne room reveals creation as worship. The Gospels reveal Christ as the one in whom that worship is gathered, fulfilled, and restored. Together, they dismantle the residual dualisms that separate spirit from matter, human from non-human, salvation from ecology. In their place emerges a vision of reality in which all levels of existence, biological, atmospheric, relational, and divine, are interwoven within a single dynamic movement toward wholeness. What has been progressively uncovered through the preceding sections, a vision of creation as liturgical, relational, and Christologically integrated, now confronts a critical tension when brought into dialogue with the present historical moment. The year 2026 does not merely mark a chronological point, it exposes a fracture. This fracture is not only ecological, but profoundly spiritual. It is not simply that ecosystems are collapsing, it is that the very capacity to perceive the world as sacred has eroded. What emerges, therefore, is a dual crisis, a crisis of environment and a crisis of meaning. At the core of this crisis lies the loss of a sacred cosmological imagination. The world is no longer experienced as a theophanic field, a space in which divine presence is mediated through material reality, but as a neutral or inert object. Nature, once perceived as a living language of revelation, has been reclassified under the categories of utility and production. Forests become timber reserves, rivers become energy resources, animals become units within supply chains. This transformation is not merely economic, it is ontological. The identity of the natural world is redefined according to its extractive value. Industrialization intensifies this shift by systematizing it. What was once localized exploitation becomes globalized infrastructure. Technological capacity enables not only the use of nature, but its optimization, acceleration, and replacement. The result is a world in which the rhythms of ecosystems are subordinated to the demands of production cycles. Time itself is restructured. Seasonal patterns yield to continuous output, regeneration yields to consumption. Within such a framework, the language of the wild, the very medium through which creation once spoke, is silenced. The consequences follow with structural inevitability. When spirituality is detached from ecology, ethical constraints weaken. If the natural world is no longer perceived as bearing intrinsic or sacred significance, then its degradation does not register as a theological problem. It becomes a technical issue, solvable through management rather than transformation. This leads directly to patterns of uncontrolled exploitation. Extraction expands beyond sustainability thresholds because no internal limit is recognized. The crisis of climate, the collapse of biodiversity, and the destabilization of planetary systems are thus not anomalies. They are the logical outcomes of a desacralized worldview. Yet precisely at this point of rupture, the possibility of reconstruction emerges. If the crisis is rooted in a distorted perception of reality, then its resolution requires not only policy changes, but a reconfiguration of ethical consciousness. It is here that an unexpected but deeply resonant framework becomes relevant: the Four Noble Truths. Though originating in a different religious tradition, their structural clarity offers a powerful template for articulating an ecological ethic that transcends confessional boundaries. Reinterpreted within this context, the first truth, traditionally understood as suffering, can be reframed as the condition of ecological distress. The planet itself becomes the site of dukkha, destabilized climates, degraded soils, polluted waters, and fragmented habitats. This is not metaphorical suffering. It is measurable, systemic, and escalating. The second truth identifies the cause: craving, or more precisely, unregulated desire. In ecological terms, this manifests as the drive for endless growth, accumulation, and consumption. It is not merely individual greed, but institutionalized desire embedded within economic and cultural systems. The third truth affirms the possibility of cessation, not as a utopian ideal, but as a realignment. Ecological restoration becomes conceivable when the forces driving degradation are interrupted. This does not imply a return to a pre-industrial past, but the emergence of a new equilibrium in which human activity operates within planetary limits. The fourth truth, the path, translates into concrete action, a disciplined, sustained commitment to practices that preserve and regenerate life. This ethical reconfiguration moves beyond abstraction when translated into responsibility. To protect biodiversity is not simply to conserve species, but to safeguard the relational networks that sustain life. Each species functions as a node within a larger system. Its loss reverberates beyond itself. Restoration, therefore, must be systemic. Reforestation, soil regeneration, water protection, these are not isolated interventions, but components of a broader effort to reweave ecological integrity. At the same time, transformation must occur at the level of lifestyle. Patterns of consumption, energy use, and production must be re-evaluated in light of their ecological impact. This is not merely a call for reduction, but for reorientation, from accumulation to sufficiency, from speed to sustainability, from extraction to participation. Ethical responsibility becomes embodied, enacted through daily practices that align human life with the rhythms of the earth. As these threads converge, the vision articulated throughout this work reaches its culmination. The universe is no longer intelligible as a collection of discrete objects or resources. It emerges as a living temple. In this temple, every being participates in a continuous act of expression. Each organism, from the smallest microorganism to the largest ecosystem, functions as a voice within a cosmic liturgy. Diversity is not incidental, it is essential. Without it, the fullness of expression is diminished. This leads to a decisive theological shift. Nature cannot be reduced to a resource without simultaneously obscuring its deeper identity. It is not merely matter to be used, but revelation to be received. The world does not simply exist, it communicates. It discloses patterns of relation, dependence, and meaning that point beyond themselves while remaining fully immanent. To encounter the natural world, in this sense, is to encounter a form of ongoing disclosure, a living text that continues to speak. The final implication is both humbling and demanding. Humanity is no longer positioned at the center, but neither is it rendered insignificant. Its role is redefined. To be human is to participate consciously within this temple, to recognize, respond, and act in ways that sustain the integrity of the whole. Responsibility replaces dominance. Attentiveness replaces control. The question is no longer how the world serves humanity, but how humanity serves the flourishing of the world. To see the world in this way is not an abstract exercise, it is a perceptual transformation. It requires learning to recognize sacredness not as something confined to specific places or moments, but as a quality that permeates existence. The forest, the river, the atmosphere, the animal, all become sites of encounter. The temple is not elsewhere, it is here, continuously unfolding. If this vision resonates with you, if you sense that theology, ecology, and lived reality must be reconnected rather than separated, then consider continuing this exploration further. Subscribe to the channel, follow upcoming reflections, and participate in an ongoing dialogue that seeks not only to interpret the world, but to re-inhabit it with depth, responsibility, and renewed awareness.